Picture this. You're walking down a dusty street in ancient Babylon, the greatest city in the world. The air is thick with incense and the smell of roasting meat from temple sacrifices. Massive ziggurats tower above you like artificial mountains, their tops disappearing into the haze. Everything seems magnificent, powerful, eternal. But then you notice something else. The way people's eyes dart nervously toward the shadows between buildings. The protective amulets hanging from every doorway. The constant murmur of prayers and incantations rising from the crowd like a desperate chorus. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, beneath all that grandeur, life was absolutely terrifying. I'm talking about a world where invisible demons possess Kulyu at any moment. Where the gods were violent, unpredictable beings who might flood the entire earth because they couldn't sleep through human noise. Where death was just the beginning of your suffering and the afterlife was a place of dust and darkness where even the greatest kings crawled like birds and ate clay. Tonight in this episode of Calm Echoes, we're going to step into that world and discover why the very people who invented writing, mathematics, and urban civilization lived in constant fear. We'll explore the nightmarish beliefs that shaped daily life for millions of people across 4,000 years of history. And by the end, you'll understand why every single aspect of existence in ancient Mesopotamia was designed around one simple goal: surviving the wrath of forces beyond human comprehension. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. These weren't primitive people cowering in caves. These were the most advanced civilizations on Earth. They built the first cities, created the first law codes, developed astronomy and medicine. Yet they lived in absolute terror of their own gods, their own dead, and the invisible world that surrounded them every single day. So let's begin with the most fundamental fear of all. The fear that shaped everything else. The fear of the gods themselves. The gods of Mesopotamia weren't like the benevolent father figures you might imagine from other religions. These were beings of pure cosmic terror. Marduk, the king of the gods, earned his throne by literally tearing apart a primordial sea monster and fashioning the world from her corpse. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, decided to destroy humanity with a flood simply because their noise was keeping him awake at night. Nergal ruled over plague and war with such violence that even other gods feared him. But here's the thing that made it truly terrifying. These gods weren't distant philosophical concepts. They were immediate physical presences in every Mesopotamian city. Each major settlement was built around a massive temple complex called a ziggurat, and inside that temple lived the actual god. Not a representation of the god, not a symbol. The god himself, in the form of a sacred statue that had to be fed, clothed, bathed, and entertained every single day. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that a few blocks away from your house, there's a being of unimaginable power who could decide your fate on a whim. A being who demands constant tribute, constant worship, constant fear. A being whose moods could bring plague, famine, war, or death to your entire city. The daily care of these divine statues was an elaborate ritual that consumed enormous resources. Every morning, priests would wake up the god by opening the doors to the inner sanctuary. They'd bring fresh clothes, cosmetics, perfumes. They'd present elaborate meals of bread, beer, meat, and fruit. They'd provide music and entertainment, all while maintaining the absolute fiction that this statue was a living, breathing deity who could strike them dead at any moment for the slightest mistake. And the people believed it completely. When the statue's eyes were opened in the morning, the god was awake. When food was placed before it, the god was eating. When the clothes were changed, the god was being dressed. The psychological weight of living under the constant gaze of these divine beings was crushing. But even worse than the major gods were the minor ones. Mesopotamians believed in thousands upon thousands of divine beings, each with their own spheres of influence, their own demands, their own capacity for vengeance. There were gods of individual cities, gods of specific trades, gods of particular families. There were gods who lived in specific trees, specific stones, specific corners of houses. You couldn't walk down a street without potentially offending a dozen different divine beings. You couldn't start a business, plant a crop, or even bake bread without considering which gods needed to be appeased. Every action, every decision, every moment of your life was shadowed by the possibility of divine retribution. And these gods were not just powerful. They were fundamentally alien. They operated by rules that humans couldn't understand, driven by motivations that made no sense to mortal minds. A god might bless your family for generations, then suddenly turn against you because of some perceived slight you weren't even aware of. They might demand human sacrifice one day and be satisfied with a loaf of bread the next. The unpredictability was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. At least with a human enemy, you could try to understand their motivations, predict their actions. But the gods were chaos given form. They were the embodiment of a universe that was fundamentally hostile to human existence. This divine terror shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian society. Laws weren't just rules made by kings, they were commands handed down by the gods themselves. Hammurabi's famous law code begins with the king explaining that the gods Anu and Enlil called him to rule and bring justice to the land. Breaking a law wasn't just a crime against society, it was a sin against the cosmic order itself. Military campaigns required elaborate rituals to determine if the gods approved. Merchants carried amulets and performed ceremonies before every major transaction. Farmers made offerings before planting and after harvest. Even the simplest activities of daily life were wrapped in layers of religious observance designed to avoid divine wrath. But the gods weren't the only source of cosmic terror in Mesopotamian life. The world was also filled with demons. Not metaphorical demons representing human vices, but actual literal demonic beings that could attack you at any moment. The most feared were the utuku, evil spirits that could possess people and drive them to madness or death. They were described as beings without physical form, invisible to the human eye, but capable of entering your body through any opening. Your mouth, your nose, your ears, even your pores. Once inside, they would corrupt your thoughts, cause illness, bring nightmares, and ultimately destroy you from within. Then there were the Asaku demons, beings of pure malevolence that brought plague and pestilence. They were said to travel in groups, sweeping across the land like an invisible army, leaving death and disease in their wake. When epidemics struck a city, people knew it was because the Asaku had arrived. The Lamassu were protective spirits, but even they were terrifying in their own way. These massive winged beings with human heads and animal bodies were carved into the walls of palaces and temples, but they weren't just decorations. People believed they were actually alive, constantly watching, constantly judging. Cross them and they could become your worst enemy. Most terrifying of all were the demons that specifically targeted children and pregnant women. Lamashtu was a female demon who would sneak into houses at night to steal babies, either killing them outright or replacing them with demonic changelings. Pregnant women lived in constant fear of her attention, wearing protective amulets and performing daily rituals to keep her at bay. These weren't abstract theological concepts. For the average Mesopotamian, demons were as real as their neighbors, as present as the air they breathed. Every unexplained illness, every nightmare, every stroke of bad luck was attributed to demonic interference. The world was a battlefield between human beings and invisible forces of evil, and humans were always on the losing side. The response to this demonic threat was a complex system of magical protection that governed every aspect of daily life. Houses were built with specific architectural features designed to confuse or repel demons. Doorways were painted with protective symbols. Rived with SP threshold stones were in cells. Every room had its own set of protective amulets. Personal protection was even more elaborate. People wore amulets made from specific stones, metals, and materials believed to have protective properties. They carried written spells folded into tiny packets and sewn into their clothing. They performed daily rituals of purification and protection, reciting incantations that had been passed down for generations. But perhaps most revealing of all was the Mesopotamian attitude towards sleep and dreams. While we might think of sleep as a time of rest and peace, for ancient Mesopotamians it was the most dangerous time of day. This was when you were most vulnerable to demonic attack, when evil spirits could enter your dreams and poison your mind. They developed an entire science of dream interpretation. Not because they thought dreams were messages from the gods, but because they needed to understand which demons had visited them during the night and what protective measures needed to be taken. A bad dream wasn't just an unpleasant experience. It was evidence of spiritual warfare being waged for your very soul. The psychological toll of living in such a world is almost impossible for us to imagine today. Every moment of every day was shadowed by supernatural threat. Every decision had to be weighed against the possibility of divine or demonic retribution. Every pleasure was tinged with fear that you might be overstepping some invisible boundary, and this was just the beginning. Because beyond the gods and demons, beyond the daily terror of supernatural attack, lay something even worse. The absolute certainty that death itself offered no escape from suffering. That the afterlife waiting for every Mesopotamian was a realm of darkness, dust, and endless torment that made earthly fears seem trivial by comparison. But that's a horror story for the next part of our journey into the nightmare that was ancient Mesopotamian existence. The Mesopotamian vision of death and the afterlife wasn't just bleak. It was a cosmic horror that made every living person count down the days to their own inevitable damnation. This wasn't a culture that believed in heaven and hell, with the possibility of redemption or eternal reward. This was a civilization convinced that death was simply the gateway to an eternity of suffering for everyone, regardless of how they lived their lives. The land of the dead was called Irkala, and it was described in terms that would make Dante's Inferno seem like a vacation resort. Picture this: a vast underground realm of absolute darkness, where the sun never shines and no living thing can grow. The ground is made of dust and clay that the dead are forced to eat for all eternity. There's no water except for stagnant pools that taste of brine and decay. The air itself is thick with the moans and wails of the countless dead who have been trapped there since the beginning of time. But here's what made it truly terrifying. In Irkala, all earthly distinctions vanished. Kings and slaves, priests and commoners, rich and poor, all were reduced to the same pathetic state. They crawled on their hands and knees like birds, their wings dragging in the dust. They ate clay and drank muddy water. They were naked, cold, and eternally hungry. The greatest heroes of legend, the mightiest rulers who had commanded vast armies, all ended up as miserable, crawling creatures in the darkness. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest literary works, drives this point home with devastating clarity. When Gilgamesh's best friend Enkidu dies, he returns in a dream to describe the afterlife. He tells of a house of dust where the dead sit in darkness, clothed like birds with feathers for garments, eating dust and clay. Even the high-end priest, the king, are there, reduced to the same degraded state as everyone else. This wasn't a temporary punishment that could be endured or overcome. This was eternity. Forever. The Mesopotamians had no concept of resurrection, no belief in reincarnation, no hope of eventual escape. Death was a one-way journey to a realm of endless suffering. And absolutely nothing you did in life could change that fate. The psychological impact of this belief cannot be overstated. Imagine living every day knowing with absolute certainty that this is as good as it gets. That every pleasure, every moment of happiness, every achievement is just a brief respite before eternal torment begins. That no matter how virtuous you are, how many good deeds you perform, how faithfully you serve the gods, you're still going to end up crawling in the dust, eating clay, and suffering in darkness forever. This knowledge infected every aspect of Mesopotamian culture. Their literature is obsessed with mortality and the horror of death. Their art frequently depicts scenes of judgment and the journey to the underworld. Their religious practices were largely focused on trying to delay death as long as possible. Not because they believed in any kind of meaningful afterlife reward, but because they knew what was waiting for them. But even more terrifying than the fate of ordinary dead were the spirits of those who died improperly. If someone wasn't buried according to the correct rituals, if their body wasn't treated with the proper ceremonies, if they died violently or far from home, their spirit would become what the Mesopotamians called an edimu. These were the most dangerous supernatural entities in their entire cosmology. An edimu was a ghost trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Unable to find peace in either realm, they were consumed with rage and jealousy toward the living, and they had the power to cause terrible harm. They could bring disease, madness, crop failure, and death. They could possess people, drive them insane, or kill them outright. They could curse entire families for generations. What made Adimu particularly terrifying was that they were almost impossible to appease. Unlike gods or demons who could sometimes be satisfied with offerings or rituals, Adimu were driven by pure malevolent rage. They wanted to drag the living down into their own state of torment, and they would pursue that goal with relentless determination. The fear of creating Adimu shaped Mesopotamian funeral practices in profound ways. Enormous resources were devoted to ensuring proper burial rites. Families would bankrupt themselves to provide adequate funeral ceremonies rather than risk creating a vengeful spirit. Bodies had to be buried in the correct orientation, with the proper grave goods, accompanied by the right prayers and rituals. Any mistake could result in supernatural revenge that might last for generations. This fear extended to warfare and violence as well. Killing someone in battle wasn't just about defeating an enemy, it was about potentially creating a supernatural threat to your entire community. Soldiers performed elaborate rituals before and after combat to try to prevent the creation of Adimu. Cities that conquered other cities would sometimes perform mass funeral rites for their defeated enemies. Not out of compassion, but out of terror of what might happen if all those improperly dead spirits decided to seek revenge. The legal system even recognized the supernatural threat posed by improper death. Laws existed specifically to ensure that executed criminals receive rites, not the proper burial because the society cared about the dignity of criminals, but because they were terrified of the supernatural consequences of creating more angry spirits. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Mesopotamian death beliefs was the way they poisoned human relationships. If you knew that everyone you loved was destined for eternal suffering, how could you form deep emotional attachments? If you knew that death could strike at any moment and transform your beloved family members into potentially dangerous spirits, how could you live with anything approaching peace of mind? The literature of the period is filled with expressions of this existential despair. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just about the death of a friend. It's about the protagonist's desperate attempt to avoid the fate that awaits all humanity. He travels to the ends of the earth, seeking some way to escape death, only to discover that immortality is reserved for the gods alone. The message is clear. We are all doomed, and there is nothing we can do about it. This wasn't just philosophical speculation. Archaeological evidence shows that Mesopotamian cities were filled with protective charms and amulets specifically designed to ward off the dead. Houses were built with special architectural features to confuse wandering spirits. Cemeteries were located far from residential areas and surrounded by walls and barriers to keep the dead from returning to trouble the living. The economic impact of these beliefs was staggering. A significant portion of the gross domestic product of Mesopotamian cities was devoted to funeral rites, protective magic, and elaborate tomb construction. Families would save for years to afford proper burial ceremonies. The wealthy built massive tombs filled with grave goods, not because they believed they could take these items with them, but because improper burial might result in supernatural revenge against their descendants. Even more resources were devoted to the care and feeding of the dead. Mesopotamians believed that the spirits of the deceased needed regular offerings of food and drink to survive in the underworld. Families were expected to bring bread, beer, and other provisions to grave sites on a regular basis. Failure to do so could result in the dead returning as vengeful spirits. This created an ongoing economic burden that lasted for generations. Families weren't just responsible for burying their dead properly, they were responsible for feeding them forever. Tomb inscriptions frequently include curses against anyone who might interfere with these offerings, threatening supernatural revenge against anyone who disrupted the feeding of the dead. The psychological pressure of living under these beliefs created a culture of constant anxiety and supernatural paranoia. People lived in fear not just of their own eventual fate, but of the anger of countless dead spirits who might decide to take revenge on the living. Every illness, every accident, every stroke of bad luck was potentially the result of supernatural attack by the improperly dead. This wasn't superstition confined to the uneducated masses. Kings and priests, the most educated and powerful people in society, were just as terrified of the dead as anyone else. Royal tombs were filled with protective amulets and magical inscriptions. Palace walls were covered with images designed to ward off evil spirits. Even the most powerful rulers lived in constant fear of supernatural revenge. The medical practices of the time reflect this supernatural terror. Mesopotamian physicians didn't just treat physical symptoms. They had to determine which supernatural entity was causing the illness and perform the appropriate rituals to drive it away. Medical texts are filled with incantations and magical formulas alongside practical treatments. Healing wasn't just about curing the body, it was about spiritual warfare against invisible enemies. But the dead weren't the only supernatural threat that emerged from Mesopotamian death beliefs. The underworld itself was ruled by terrifying deities who could extend their influence into the world of the living. Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead, was described as a being of pure malevolence who delighted in human suffering. Nergal, her consort, brought plague and death wherever he walked. These weren't distant, abstract deities. They were active forces in daily life, constantly seeking to expand their realm by dragging more victims down into the darkness. The stories told about these underworld deities reveal a culture consumed by death anxiety. When the goddess Inanna descends to the underworld to visit her sister, Ereshkigal, she's immediately killed and hung on a hook. Elaborate a piece, the gods themselves' intervention saves safe from the horror eternal torment. The message, like Rickery and Divine, are not tea of meat. Only cultures that develop her from of death and is clear. Evenemism shape Pest world. This cosmic Mesopotamian philosophy the under and world view in profound ways. Unlike concepts of noble death, heroic sacrifice, or meaningful martyrdom, Mesopotamians saw death as an absolute evil to be avoided at all costs. Their heroes weren't celebrated for dying gloriously in battle, but for finding ways to cheat death and extend their lives. The terror of death and the supernatural infected every aspect of creative expression. Mesopotamian art is filled with images of monsters, of supernatural demons, and scenes horror. Their music included funeral dirges and lamentations for the dead. Their poetry is obsessed with mortality and the brevity of life. Even their humor tends toward the gallows variety, making jokes about death as a way of coping with its inevitable horror. And yet paradoxically, this same culture that lived in constant terror of death and the supernatural also produced some of humanity's greatest early achievements. They built magnificent cities, developed complex systems of law and government, made advances in mathematics and astronomy that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. How did a people living in such psychological torment manage to create such remarkable civilizations? The answer might lie in the very terror that defined their existence. When you believe that life is brief and death is eternal torment, every moment becomes precious. When you know that supernatural forces are constantly threatening your existence, you develop elaborate systems of cooperation and mutual protection. When you're convinced that the gods are watching and judging your every action, you create detailed codes of law and social behavior. Terror, in other words, might have been the driving force behind Mesopotamian achievement. Their magnificent cities weren't built despite their supernatural fears, but because of them. Their complex religious and legal systems weren't separate responses to it. Their advances from their cosmic terror, but direct in knowledge and technology, weren't escapes from their frightening worldview, but tools for surviving in a universe they believed was fundamentally hostile to human existence. But even as they built their ziggurats and wrote their law codes, even as they made their offerings to the gods and performed their protective rituals, the fundamental terror remained. Because underlying all their achievements, all their attempts and meaning to create order, was the unshakable belief that they were temporary creatures in a permanent nightmare, counting down the days until their inevitable descent into eternal suffering. And this brings us to perhaps the most terrifying aspect of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. Matter what, the knowledge that you achieved, no matter how powerful you became, no matter how faithfully you served the gods, you were still going to die. And death for a Mesopotamian wasn't a peaceful rest or a reunion with loved ones. It was the beginning of an eternity that made every earthly suffering seem trivial by comparison. This cosmic horror didn't just shape how Mesopotamians thought about death. It infected every single moment of their waking lives with a paranoia so complete that it's difficult for modern minds to comprehend. Because if the afterlife was guaranteed torment, then the only rational response was to cling to earthly existence with desperate intensity, no matter how much suffering that existence contained. And suffering it did contain. The physical realities of life in ancient Mesopotamia were brutal enough without adding supernatural terror to the mix. This was a world where child mortality rates approached 50%. Where famines could wipe out entire cities, where diseases we can cure with antibiotics killed millions, where warfare was constant, vicious, and conducted with weapons designed to maximize pain and humiliation. But here's what made it truly nightmarish. Every single one of these earthly horrors was attributed to supernatural causes. When your child died of fever, it wasn't because of natural disease. It was because a demon had possessed them, or because you had somehow offended a god, or because the spirit of an improperly buried ancestor had decided to take revenge on your family. When crops failed and people starved, it wasn't due to weather patterns or agricultural challenges. It was divine punishment for some transgression that might have occurred generations ago. This wasn't just physical, meant that suffering. It was moral, it was spiritual. It was evidence that you or your ancestors had failed in some fundamental way to maintain proper relationships with the supernatural world. Every tragedy carried with it not just grief and pain, but crushing guilt and the terror that worse punishments might come. The medical practices of the time reveal just how completely this supernatural worldview dominated Mesopotamian thinking. When someone fell ill, the first step wasn't to treat their symptoms. It was to determine which attack supernatural entity had them and why. Physicians worked alongside priests and exorcists to perform elaborate diagnostic rituals that might take days or weeks to complete. They would examine the patient's dreams, searching for clues about which demons had visited them. They would review the patient's recent activities, looking for any action that might have offended a god or violated a taboo. They would consult elaborate charts that mapped the correspondence between different types of illness and different supernatural causes. They would perform divination rituals using oil on water, the flight patterns of birds, or the examination of animal entrails. Only after they had identified the supernatural cause of the illness would they begin any kind of physical treatment. And even then, the medical interventions were often secondary to the spiritual ones. Healing required not just medicine, but elaborate ceremonies of purification, exorcism, and divine appeasement that could last for months. Imagine being sick in such a world. You're already suffering from physical pain and weakness. But on top of that, you're told that your illness is evidence of spiritual failure, that some demon has chosen you as a target, that you or your family have somehow angered forces beyond your comprehension, that your recovery depends not just on your body's ability to heal, but on your ability to correctly identify and appease whatever supernatural entity is tormenting you. And as the psychological burden was crushing. Patients weren't just fighting disease, they were fighting guilt, terror, and the constant fear that they might die without properly resolving their spiritual crisis, thus condemning themselves to even worse suffering in the afterlife. But physical illness was just one way that the supernatural world could intrude into daily life. The Mesopotamians believed that invisible forces were constantly manipulating earthly events for their own inscrutable purposes. Business failures, relationship problems, accidents, even minor inconveniences were all attributed to supernatural interference. This created a culture of constant vigilance and paranoid hypervigilance. Before making any important decision, people had to consult divination specialists who would determine whether the supernatural world approved of their plans. Before starting a business, building a house, getting married, or even taking a journey, elaborate rituals had to be performed to ensure divine favor, or at least avoid divine wrath. The economic impact of this supernatural paranoia was staggering. A huge portion of every family's income went to priests, diviners, exorcists, and other religious specialists who promised protection from supernatural attack. People bought amulets, commissioned protective spells, and paid for elaborate rituals with money they could barely afford to spend. The fear of supernatural revenge was so intense that families would bankrupt themselves rather than risk offending the gods or demons. But even more devastating than the economic cost was the psychological toll. Imagine living in a world where you can never be certain that any decision you make is safe, where every choice might trigger supernatural revenge, where success in any endeavor depends not just on your own skill and effort, but on the whims of invisible beings whose motivations you can't understand, and whose favor you can never be sure you possess. The legal system of ancient Mesopotamia reflects this supernatural terror in fascinating and disturbing ways. Laws weren't just rules created by human authorities. They were commands handed down by the gods themselves, and violating them was considered a cosmic crime that could bring down divine wrath on entire communities. When someone was accused of a crime, the legal process often involved supernatural tests. Suspects might be thrown into rivers on the theory that the water god would save the innocent and drown the guilty. They might be forced to drink poison with survival taken as evidence of divine protection. They might have to undergo trial by ordeal, with their guilt or innocence determined by their ability to endure various forms of torture without dying. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were the formal legal procedures used by the most advanced civilizations of their time. Judges, lawyers, and legal scholars all accepted that supernatural forces were active participants in the judicial process. Justice wasn't something that humans could determine through evidence and reasoning alone. It required divine intervention. The implications were terrifying. If you were accused of a crime, your fate depended not on the strength of the evidence or the skill of your defense, but on whether various gods decided to protect you during supernatural trials. And since the gods were known to be capricious, unpredictable, and often hostile to humanity, there was no guarantee that innocence would be rewarded or guilt punished. Even more disturbing was the concept of collective responsibility. Mesopotamians believed that the crimes of individuals could bring divine punishment down on entire families, tribes, or cities. When disasters struck, the first response was to search for someone whose sins might have triggered divine wrath. Scapegoating wasn't just a social phenomenon. It was a religious necessity. This created a culture where everyone was constantly monitoring everyone else for signs of behavior that might anger the gods. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Family members turned against each other. Social cohesion was maintained not through trust and mutual support, but through shared terror of collective punishment. The workplace was another arena where supernatural fears dominated daily life. Every profession had its own patron deity who had to be properly honored and appeased. Farmers made offerings to grain gods before planting and harvest. Merchants performed rituals before major transactions. Craftsmen blessed their tools and workshops. Soldiers carried protective amulets into battle. But more than that, professional success was seen as evidence of divine favor, while failure was proof of supernatural disfavor. If your crops failed, it wasn't because of weather or pests. It was because you had somehow offended the agricultural gods. If your business went bankrupt, it wasn't due to market forces or poor management. It was divine punishment for some transgression. This meant that professional life was a constant performance of religious devotion. Workers had to demonstrate not just competence in their trades, but perfect adherence to the supernatural requirements of their professions. A single mistake in ritual observance could be blamed for any subsequent failures, destroying both career and reputation. The educational system, such as it was, focused heavily on training people to navigate this supernatural minefield. Children learned not just practical skills like reading and writing, but elaborate catalogs of divine names, proper ritual procedures, and the complex rules governing interactions with supernatural beings. Schools were often attached to temples, and teachers were usually priests or other religious specialists. The curriculum included extensive memorization of hymns, prayers, and magical formulas. Students learned to identify different types of omens and their meanings. They studied the proper ways to approach various gods and demons. They practiced the rituals that would be essential for survival in adult life. But even education itself was seen as a potentially dangerous activity. Knowledge, particularly religious knowledge, was considered a form of power that could attract unwanted supernatural attention. Students had to perform protective rituals before studying. Teachers had to be careful not to share knowledge with those who weren't properly prepared to handle it. The very act of learning was fraught with supernatural peril. Family life in ancient Mesopotamia was perhaps the arena where supernatural terror had its most intimate and devastating effects. Marriage wasn't just a union between two people. It was a merger of two families' relationships with the supernatural world. Before any marriage could take place, elaborate divination rituals had to be performed to ensure that the union wouldn't anger any of the gods or demons associated with either family. Pregnancy and childbirth were times of particular supernatural vulnerability. Expecting mothers lived in constant fear of demons like Lamashtu, who specifically targeted pregnant women and newborns. They wore elaborate protective amulets, performed deification rituals, and often spent months in ritual seclusion to avoid attracting demonic attention. The high rates of infant and maternal mortality meant that these fears were constantly reinforced by tragic reality. When babies died or mothers died in childbirth, it wasn't attributed to natural causes but to successful demonic attacks. This created a cycle where supernatural terror fed on real tragedy, and real tragedy seemed to confirm the accuracy of supernatural beliefs. Raising children in such a world meant teaching them to live in constant fear. From the earliest age, children learned that they were surrounded by invisible beings who might harm them at any moment. They learned elaborate rules about how to behave to avoid attracting supernatural attention. They learned to recognize the signs of demonic attack and the proper responses to such attacks. But perhaps most tragically, they learned that their parents couldn't really protect them. No matter how much love and care parents provided, no matter how many protective rituals they performed, children could still be taken by demons, struck down by angry gods, or claimed by the countless supernatural forces that filled their world. This created a fundamental anxiety that colored every aspect of family relationships. Parents loved their children desperately, but they also knew that attachment brought suffering. Children were taught to be grateful for every day they remained alive and healthy, because tomorrow they might be claimed by forces beyond human control. The psychological impact on children growing up in such an environment is almost impossible to imagine. Modern psychology recognizes that children who grow up in constant fear of unpredictable threats often develop severe anxiety disorders, depression, and other mental health problems. For Mesopotamian children, such fear wasn't an aberration. It was the normal condition of existence, and yet somehow these children grew up to become the adults who built one of history's most remarkable civilizations. They created art, literature, and architecture that we still admire today. They developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge that laid the foundation for later scientific advances. They established legal and political systems that influenced human civilization for millennia. How did they do it? How did people living in such complete psychological terror manage to achieve so much? The answer might lie in the very nature of their fears. When you believe that supernatural forces are constantly threatening your existence, you develop elaborate systems of cooperation and mutual protection. When you're convinced that your survival depends on maintaining proper relationships with invisible beings, you create detailed protocols for every aspect of life. Terror, in other words, might have been the organizing principle that made Mesopotamian civilization possible. Their achievements weren't accomplished despite their fears, but because of them. The same supernatural beliefs that filled their lives with anxiety also provided the framework for creating complex, stable societies that could endure for thousands of years. But the cost was enormous. The psychological burden of living in constant supernatural terror created a civilization that was simultaneously brilliant and tormented, creative and paranoid, magnificent and miserable. They built wonders that still inspire awe today, but they built them in the shadow of cosmic horror that made every moment of their lives a struggle against invisible forces of destruction. And underlying it all was the knowledge that no achievement, no matter how great, could change their ultimate fate. That death was waiting for everyone, and death meant eternal suffering in a realm of darkness and dust. That all their magnificent cities, their beautiful art, their profound literature, their revolutionary ideas were just temporary distractions from the horror that awaited every human soul. This was the fundamental tragedy of ancient Mesopotamian existence. They created one of humanity's first great civilizations. But they did it while believing that civilization itself was ultimately meaningless in the face of cosmic forces that were fundamentally hostile to human flourishing. They achieved immortality through their cultural legacy. But they lived and died believing that true immortality was impossible and that death was the gateway to eternal torment. But there's one more layer to this nightmare that we haven't explored yet. Because beyond all the supernatural terrors, beyond all the fears of gods and demons and the horror of death, there was something even more psychologically devastating about life in ancient Mesopotamia. Something that made all their other fears seem almost bearable by comparison. The thing that made it all truly unbearable wasn't just the fear itself. It was the absolute certainty that there was no escape, no redemption, no hope that things could ever get better. Because woven into every aspect of Mesopotamian belief was the crushing understanding that this terror was not temporary. It was the permanent condition of human existence, ordained by the gods themselves from the very beginning of time. You see, other cultures throughout history have developed beliefs that, while frightening, at least offered some possibility of transcendence. The promise that suffering might lead to wisdom, that virtue might be rewarded, that death might bring peace, that future generations might live better lives. But Mesopotamian cosmology offered none of these consolations. It was a closed system of cosmic horror with doors, no exit. Their creation myths tell us everything we need to know about how they viewed the human condition. According to the Enuma Elish, humanity wasn't created out of love or divine benevolence. We were created as slaves, literally. The gods were tired of doing their own work, so they fashioned human beings from clay and the blood of a rebellious deity to serve as their laborers. Our entire species exists for one purpose: to feed the gods, maintain their temples, and suffer for their entertainment. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't symbolic language about the human relationship with the divine. This was the literal truth about why humans existed at all. You were born to be a slave to beings who viewed you as less than an insect. Your life, your suffering, your terror, your eventual death and eternal torment, all of it was designed by cosmic forces that felt nothing but contempt for your very existence. The psychological implications of this belief system are staggering. Morning knowing. Imagine waking up with absolute certainty that you are an unwanted accident in a universe that considers you a nuisance at best. That every breath you take is borrowed time before cosmic forces decide you've outlived your usefulness. That your hopes, dreams, ambitions, and achievements are not just meaningless, but actively offensive to the powers that control reality. This wasn't existential philosophy. This wasn't abstract theological speculation. This was concrete, practical knowledge that shaped every decision, every relationship, every moment of consciousness for millions of people across thousands of years. When a Mesopotamian farmer planted his crops, he wasn't just hoping for a good harvest. He was desperately trying to produce enough surplus to keep the gods from deciding his existence was no longer worth tolerating. When a merchant negotiated a trade deal, he wasn't just trying to make a profit. He was attempting to generate enough wealth to fund the elaborate rituals and offerings that might delay divine punishment for another season. When parents raised their children, they weren't just trying to prepare them for successful adult lives. They were training them to be effective slaves to cosmic masters who might decide to destroy them on a whim. The economic structure of Mesopotamian society reflects this cosmic slavery in ways that are both fascinating and horrifying. The temple complexes weren't just religious centers. They were the literal households of the gods, and they consumed enormous portions of the total economic output of their cities. Archaeologists estimate that in some periods up to 60% of all agricultural production went directly to feeding and maintaining the divine residence of the ziggurats. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. More than half of everything they produced went to beings who, according to their own beliefs, viewed them with contempt and would eventually consign them to eternal suffering regardless of how faithfully they served. At a cosmic scale, except was a protection racket on the protection being offered was merely temporary postponement of inevitable doom. The labor required to maintain this system was crushing. Thousands of people worked full-time just to care for the god statues in the major temples. They had to be fed multiple elaborate meals every day. They had to be bathed, clothed, perfumed, and entertained. They needed fresh flowers, incense, music, and constant attendance. The resources devoted to keeping these statues comfortable exceeded what most human families could afford for their own survival. And remember, these weren't symbols or representations. In the Mesopotamian mind, these were the actual gods themselves, physically present and demanding constant service. The psychological weight of knowing that your city's survival depended on properly caring for a being who could destroy you all if the morning bath was too cold or the evening meal was served a few minutes late must have been absolutely crushing. But the temples were just the beginning. Every household, every business, every public building had its own collection of protective deities that required regular attention. Small shrines with their own statues, their own offerings, their own elaborate care routines. The average family spent a significant portion of their income and time maintaining relationships with dozens of supernatural beings, each with their own demands and their own capacity for terrible revenge. The time and energy devoted to these religious obligations meant that Mesopotamian life operated under constant resource scarcity that was entirely self-imposed. People lived in poverty not because their land was unproductive or their technology was inadequate, but because they were convinced that their survival depended on feeding an enormous supernatural bureaucracy that consumed the majority of their output. And the cruelest part? It never worked. Despite all the offerings, all the rituals, all the desperate attempts to appease their cosmic masters, bad things still happened, crops still failed. Diseases still struck, wars still came, children still died. The gods accepted their tribute and then inflicted suffering anyway because that was their nature. They were fundamentally hostile to human well-being, and no amount of worship could change that fact. This created a psychological trap that was almost impossible to escape. When disasters struck despite faithful worship, the response wasn't to question the system. It was to assume that the worship hadn't been faithful enough, that some mistake had been made, that greater devotion was required. Every failure of the system to protect them was interpreted as evidence that they needed to sacrifice even more to make it work. Families would literally starve themselves to afford the offerings they believed were necessary to protect them from supernatural attack. They would sell their children into slavery to raise. They would work money for temple donations themselves to death, trying to generate enough surplus to satisfy the endless demands of their divine masters. And when these sacrifices failed to prevent suffering, they would blame themselves for not giving enough. The legal codes of the period reveal just how completely this divine slavery had penetrated every aspect of social organization. Laws weren't just rules created by human authorities to maintain order. They were commands from the gods about how their human slaves should behave. Breaking a law wasn't just a crime against society. It was an act of rebellion against cosmic masters who had the right to torture you forever as punishment. The famous Code of Hammurabi begins with the king explaining that the gods Anu and Enlil specifically called him to establish justice on earth. The laws that follow aren't presented as human wisdom or social contracts. They're divine commands that carry the full weight of supernatural authority. Violating them means facing not just earthly punishment, but cosmic revenge that could extend across generations. This divine authority behind human law meant that social hierarchy was seen as a reflection of cosmic order. Kings ruled because the gods commanded it. Slaves served because the gods demanded it. Social inequality wasn't an accident or injustice that might be reformed. It was the deliberate design of supernatural beings who had arranged human society for their own convenience. The implications for social mobility and individual agency were devastating. If your position in society was determined by divine will, then attempting to improve your circumstances wasn't just difficult, it was blasphemous. Slaves who tried to escape weren't just breaking human laws, they were rebelling against the cosmic order itself. Peasants who aspired to wealth weren't just ambitious, they were challenging the gods' right to determine human fate. This created a social system that was incredibly stable precisely because it was so psychologically oppressive. People didn't rebel against injustice because they were convinced that injustice was divinely ordained. They didn't fight against poverty because they believed poverty was their assigned role in the cosmic hierarchy. They didn't challenge authority because they were taught that authority came directly from beings who could torture them forever as punishment for disobedience. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of this cosmic slavery was the way it poisoned human relationships. If everyone around you was also a slave to hostile supernatural forces, if everyone was desperately competing for divine favor that might never come, if everyone was one mistake away from cosmic punishment that could destroy whole families, how could you trust anyone? How could you form genuine bonds of affection and loyalty? Mesopotamian literature is filled with examples of betrayal, suspicion, and the breakdown of social bonds under supernatural pressure. Friends turned against friends when disasters struck, each blaming the other for attracting divine wrath. Families fractured when members were suspected of violating religious taboos. Communities tore themselves apart, searching for scapegoats to blame for collective punishments. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great work of literature, is fundamentally a story about the impossibility of human friendship in a world where death and cosmic horror make all relationships temporary and painful. Gilgamesh and Enkidu achieve a brief, beautiful bond, but it's destroyed when the gods decide to kill Enkidu as punishment for their adventures. The message is clear: love makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability in a cosmos ruled by hostile forces is a luxury you can't afford. This poisoning of human relationships created a feedback loop that made the supernatural terror even more intense. When people can't trust each other, they become more dependent on supernatural protection. When human bonds are weak, divine authority seems more necessary. When communities are fractured by suspicion and fear, individuals feel more isolated and vulnerable to cosmic forces beyond their control. The result was a civilization that was simultaneously sophisticated and primitive, advanced and backward, brilliant and broken. They created writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law. They built magnificent cities and produced profound literature. They developed technologies and social institutions that influenced human development for millennia. but they did it all while believing they were unwanted slaves in a universe designed to torture them. Their achievements weren't expressions of human dignity and potential. They were desperate attempts to delay inevitable cosmic punishment. Their cities weren't celebrations of human community. They were fortresses built to protect slaves from their supernatural masters. Their art wasn't an expression of beauty and creativity. It was propaganda designed to demonstrate proper submission to divine authority. So there you have it. The terrifying reality of what it meant to be human in ancient Mesopotamia. A world where every breath was borrowed time, every joy was shadowed by cosmic dread, and every achievement was just a temporary distraction from inevitable eternal suffering. They built the foundations of civilization itself while believing they were nothing more than unwanted slaves in a universe designed to torture them. Perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all, that humanity's greatest early accomplishments were born not from hope or confidence, but from absolute terror and the desperate need to survive forces beyond comprehension.